Well, welcome to Ramsey Campbell, probably the one person that was responsible for me spending so much time reading in my bedroom from the age of about 14 onwards and still to this day. So
Is that because you were ashamed of people seeing what you're reading?
no, it's just a place, like my safe space, you know what I mean?
Got
Just
you, got
where it
you.
was quiet. So for the people that, the few people that aren't aware of who you are, so explain what sort of writer you are. What do you write?
I write horror.
Okay, and what
That's
sort
what I
of
say. That's what I say. But having said that, of course, I've also written a book-length study of the Three Stooges and a book of video, well, yeah, DVD, Blu-ray reviews, and
Mhm.
a couple of books of essays on everything under the sun, basically, from the Highgate Vampire to Mary Whitehouse. So, I'm a Renaissance man. That's what I am.
What got you into writing originally?
Well, reading basically. I mean, I love to read from the earliest possible age. And I've got to tell you that my precociousness rivaled that of Wilbur Whateley in the Dunwich Horror. Because I mean, by the time I was like, well, I don't think I was two when I was reading properly. By the time I was four, I was certainly reading Hans Andersen and real books.
Hmm.
Uh, Came six. And my mother thought, presumably, thought I was old enough to use her tickets at the local public library to take out adult books, were mainly science fiction, not much fantasy, and what there was horror, generally speaking, was packaged as ghost stories. So the
Hmm.
very first example of that I remember ever reading was an anthology called 50 Years of Ghost Stories, which had some M.R. James, it had Algernon Blackwood, E.F. Benson, it had lots and lots of the classics basically. But it was M.R. James who, above all, got to be on a sheer sort of visceral level, and kept me awake at night for weeks
Mhm.
after I read A Warning to the Curious and the Residents at Whitminster, the second of which is kind of rare. Well, not rare, but seldom anthologized, I should say. And that was the one that stayed in my mind most of all.
Hmm.
In fact, it was a couple of images from it. There's a moment where somebody is searching through a chest of drawers and comes to the bottom drawer, and a little pink hand comes groping out, which I did not forget in a hurry when I was lying awake in the dark, for weeks to come. And in fact, the book went back to the library. I think it had been ordered in from a different branch for somebody, so it just happened to be there on the shelf when I spotted it. And so I couldn't get it again. And so it was years before I was able to pin down what that story was and who it had been by.
Hmm.
But that was, where my love of M.R. James started right there. And my love of the field, certainly the adult horror fiction, because I had been reading things like the Princess and the Goblin before that, which technically speaking is for kids, so it was written for children, but actually has some terrible M.R. Jamesian moments of supernatural menace, dread, really.
Hmm.
So really, I sought this out wherever I could find it, and so it really was no surprise that ultimately I wanted to pay back some of the pleasure that reading all this had given me. And so I started writing. Well, I started seriously in the sense of writing short stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end. When I was 11, I mean, there were terrible short stories, a book called Ghostly Tales, which were basically bits of favourite stories stuck together with no particular regard for whether they fitted or not, but like some of the versions of Frankenstein's monster in the movies. But nevertheless, here I was writing, and finishing stories, and I suppose I got my start in a way right there.
Hmm. Why do you think people like reading horror?
Well, for me, I mean, I can only talk about myself. It engages my imagination. I love the uncanny, but I also, have a real fascination with, the further reaches of human psychology. And you'll find one of those, very often both actually, in horror fiction. So I'm
Hmm.
not saying, I mean, I have to say, I don't go to it particularly to be frightened. I mean, in a way, I wish there were more things that did that for me. These days, there are not very often. I mean, Michel Paver's Dark Matter got to me on a pretty deep level recently. I mean, that was one. Oh, Adam Neville's No One Gets Out Alive, that whole series of chapters where you go into one dreadful haunted room and then there's yet another even more dreadfully haunted room beyond that. And you really feel, are we ever going to get out of this nightmare, which we eventually do, but not for some time to come. That did it. So I'm certainly not averse to being frightened by the arts in whatever way, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
But very few things do it for me anymore. And, a frisson of pleasure, certainly, but real sort of visceral terror. Well, the movies, several of the films of David Lynch, yes, in terms of movies for sure, but that's mostly it. Although actually recently, a film that not enough people have heard of, I don't think, called Speak No Evil, which is presently on the Shudder channel.
Right.
And Jenny and I watched it. I mean, it's a Scandinavian movie that starts as a sort of comedy of embarrassment, social awkwardness, and because that was apparently what the makers started making, and they followed it where it went. And when the film came to an end, Jenny and I just looked at each other and had nothing to say, and we were both genuinely shaken. I'll say no more than that, but Speak No Evil. If you haven't seen it, give it a shot.
Right, I will do. Thank you. Do you think, in many ways, because of the need for that imagination, that horror is one of the hardest types of literature to write? It's to me, it's a lot like comedy, because in the fact that you need that surprise element. So, comedy is not funny unless you get that surprise.
Right.
And it's the same with horror. Would you sort of think about, do you agree with that?
Not necessarily, no, because I think there is the kind of horror where you can see it coming. The character can't. I mean, in that sense, it's in a way, it's more like a tragedy. Actually, it's also a bit like comedy because, after all, aren't there many moments in, say, Laurel and Hardy when we know what's going to happen before it does, and part of the pleasure is watching it happen when it happens.
Yeah.
And what poor old Oliver, and maybe Stan as well, gets it in the neck or whichever bit of their anatomy yet again. But we can predict it, but it's the way it delivers it that's important sometimes. Certainly, the element of shock is a shock, or as you say, surprise. That kind of shock, is important. One thing that is crucial, I think, to both horror and comedy is timing.
Yeah.
Timing's got to be right. And if you can do that, well, you can bring off the expected as well as the unexpected. I think, in a way, I think they work equally well, depending on how well they're done.
Well, apparently Lovecraft was a big influence on you in your early life, wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So, what was it about his writing that you liked?
Well, let me go back a little bit and put it into a kind of a context, because back in 1960 was the first time I ever encountered Lovecraft in quantity. I'd read him in the occasional anthology. I had read The Colour Out of Space when I was 8, and by gum, that was a baptism of fire. But otherwise, relatively minor stuff in the main that showed up in August Derleth's science fiction anthologies. But I know, I mean, people are going to, you and your audience probably will find this difficult to believe unless you know it. But in 1960, there had never been a single Lovecraft collection in British paperback, ever. I mean, now, Penguin Modern Classics, everywhere you look, there's Lovecraft in all sorts of forms. There's even the Three Stooges meet Cthulhu as a comic book, let me tell you. But in 1960, no, one hardcover collection, and that was back in the 50s, and impossible to find then. And so I found this book in a it wasn't even a bookshop as such, it was a sort of general store with books in it, that kind of place, which existed a lot more then than now. And a book called Cry Horror, which had the call of Cthulhu, if you want to call him that, pronounce him how you will. It had The Colour Out of Space, the rats in the walls, so it had some of his greatest stuff, and also some relatively minor stuff. But the thing is, I read that book, I seized it, fearing that by the time I got my money out of my pocket, somebody else would have grabbed it, and I'd never see it again. But no, I got it, skived off school the next day and read it from cover to cover, and I just immersed myself completely in Lovecraft. I was already writing now quite a bit, I mean, trying out imitating other favorite writers. But at this point, I think I knew this is what I want to do. I want to, well, kid myself that I was doing as well as Lovecraft, which I most certainly was not. But at least, I did my best. And even at the very outset, I tried not just to recycle Lovecraft's creations, but, come up with some of my own. And, duly sent these off simply from his opinion to August Derleth at Arkham House when I was, let me see, just 15, actually. I sent him a few. And he quite reasonably said, this needs a lot of work. These stories need a lot of work. You need to reset them into England because you've clearly lived outside of England, even though you're setting them in Massachusetts. And you need to get the characters to talk to each other. You need to, to tone down your prose, which Lord knows, I sort of felt, all the adjectives that Lovecraft used in his most purple, which is very infrequently, you ought to stuff those in all the time, which I was doing. So, I duly did all the work, wrote some more stories, and Derleth began to publish them. And Arkham House when I turned 18, which is 60 years ago, folks, I published my first Lovecraft imitation book, and that set me on my path, I think.
Brilliant. Well, you said that he gave you the advice to set your stories in England, didn't he? But why did you choose the Severn Valley as a location? Because you're from Liverpool originally, aren't you?
Yes. Well, to be very honest with you, that was his idea. He said, maybe use the Severn Valley because there will be traces of the ancient Roman practices there.
Yeah.
You can maybe tie in. Well, you see, had I thought about this a bit more, much closer to me is Chester. And that's also got lots and lots of ancient Roman stuff. So I could have used that and gone there and looked. Whereas I confess, well, it's pretty evident, I suspect, to a lot of people. I've never been to the Severn Valley when I wrote that first book. And, gently rolling the Cotswolds are not. If you try to find a pub on the top of one, you'll find out how little gentle they are, But back then, it obviously convinced the Americans, which was, I suppose, what I needed to do at that point. And that was why. So I invented this kind of parallel series of locations that, there's Bridchester for Arkham and, various stuff like that. And of course, because I actually, several of those early stories I'd already set in Lovecraft country, I then simply, reimagined the settings and kept the story so that, I think the church in High Street was originally set in Kingsport, for instance, the site of Lovecraft's The Festival. So I rejigged that and it became Temp Hill and so on. So basically, I sort of anglicised them as best I could. But well, it seemed to work for old August Derleth, and that was the main thing.
How much research would you do on a novel, especially
these days?
Yeah, well, anyway, I mean, let's say you were starting off now. How much research would you do now?
Oh, a great deal more. Yes, I mean, basically, I would try and go and look at the very least. Back then, here we are, 15 years old. It's a big trek to the Severn Valley. I mean, these days I go drive there, which I often have. I mean, I think ancient, the Hungry Moon set up in the Peak District. Now, actually, we had already been there, so it's partly drawing upon what I already knew and the inspiration of that wonderful landscape. But I did drive over there and drive around quite a bit before I started writing that novel. Ancient Images. I went across the other side of the country for the setting that's the main location of that story and so on. These days, I mean, I confess, and here I am passionately opposed to AI, but at the same time, I will use the internet. Because if you want to find out what there is at a location. Well, it's probably you can actually do so by there will be videos of that place on the internet, and I think basically if you can imagine yourself into the setting, if you researched enough about it, then these days I suppose, and also age triumphing over me, I may not actually go and drive them, but I'll just I imagine based on the details I can find.
When you start a story, what's your process? Do you have an outline in mind before you start?
No, not as such, and certainly not a plot. What I will do for, let's say, for a novel, I gather a lot of, well, first of all, I get the initial idea,
Mm.
which may be, a tiny thing. So, I mean, the novel is coming out toward the end of the year now, in November, actually, the incubations. That had lain around in my notebooks for about several decades. Just the idea of twin towns, a town that's twinned with somewhere else, across, say, in Europe. And, in my original notion that the other town was going to be run by magicians. So it's a bit like Alfred and Blackwood, ancient sorcery, something like that. And I
Mm.
couldn't see how to work that. So it got turned into something else. Actually got turned into a novel called Midnight Sun, which I wrote in the late 80s. And so that got so far away from that initial idea, that the initial idea was still there to be used. And I came upon it again quite recently and thought, yeah, well, there is something here. What's to be done? And it occurred to me to look into, well, why were towns twinned at all? Well, of course, it was to
Mm.
re-cement relations, particularly with Germany after the Second World War. So, okay, well, now we've got Germany, maybe we've got the Alps, maybe we've got some sort of Alpine legend. Maybe the person who goes to visit there, unbeknownst to himself, when he comes back to his hometown, brings some presence with him. And that's where we started off from. And I mean, I have to say that some of the research that I did for that, I'm a
Mm.
huge believer in the happy accident in creativity. Things that I didn't know till I found out about them, but are absolutely germane to what I'm planning to write or I'm writing now.
Mm.
In this case, I'm not going to ruin this because I was rather proud of it when I realized how well it would fit. But
Right.
there's a particular Alpine tradition that was absolutely perfect for this novel. And so that became absolutely central to the book. And what I do then, having reached this point, because there's always that sort of limbo of in creating any story where you don't know what the characters are called, you don't know what they do in life, you don't know
Mm.
where they live. It's somehow groping in the dark until eventually somehow your subconscious comes up with, the initial sparks that will eventually ignite into the characters and the setting and the rest of it and the development of the idea. So I
Mm.
gather a lot of material. I do write down lots of ideas for scenes in the novel that may or may not be incorporated eventually. And I have a sort of general sense before I start of at least the approximate order of the main events of the novel or some of the main events. And obviously you've got to know where the order of the early events and scenes of the book, you'd never get started. You wouldn't know where to start. But having got to that point, I tend to feel, the thing has now gathered enough energy to push me into starting it. And at that point, and it's purely instinctive, off I go. And well, so far it's worked pretty well. But of course, there's always the great reassurance you can always rewrite. And I mean, I get more and more ruthless in doing that, and I have great fun doing it.
Mm. Your stories are always very character-led, aren't they? How
Mhm.
much freedom do you give to your characters to sort of develop and change in your story?
Well, I want them to surprise me, basically. In fact, I want the whole damn thing to surprise me in the writing, where, I want to come here, when I'm talking to you now, at my desk, and be surprised, write something I didn't know I was going to write. But yeah, generally, I mean, particularly a novel, not so much a short story, though to some extent
Mm.
that too. But certainly a novel, for me, it's a process of discovery.
Yeah.
Exploration, and that particularly goes for the characters. I gradually find out about them, what they feel, what they think, and so forth. And once there's some of that, then there's more of it. That more and more will arise out of what I've already found out about them. But with luck, they carry on surprising me. Now, not everybody believes in that approach. I mean, E.M. Forster was a great champion. Nabokov, on the other hand, condemned it completely. But and as a Nabokovian, because he was, after Lovecraft, possibly the single greatest revelation for me as a writer. Who sent me on my the path I eventually followed. Perhaps I should agree with him, but I don't. So there you are.
You seem quite interested in sort of local folklore and that sort of thing.
Mm.
Whereabouts do you get your information from on that?
Oh well, just looking around, I've got well. I mean, the book that was most crucial in that area probably was Creatures of the Pool, which is a novel set in Liverpool, and drawing very extensively on the history of Liverpool, from its earliest days as a town, where it had 7 streets. And I went, oh, I don't know, years, maybe 10 years. I mean, that was the longest research I ever did for a novel or for
Mm.
anything. And I was whenever I go to a second-hand bookshop, if it was anything, the older the better, and the less reprinted the better, the less familiar the better.
Mm.
On Liverpool or Merseyside, I'd buy it. And so I've got a whole bunch of shelves back there in our library, which basically we call our house is the library. Basically, you know what I mean. But I've got several shelves of often pretty obscure books on Liverpool, and
Mm.
well, I read through all of them, and while researching what would eventually become the Creatures of the Pool, I wrote down ideas, and sometimes I'd transcribe bits of the book. Sometimes I'd kind of do a riff on what I'd read, and I'd elaborate on it, and sometimes I would invent some sort of legendary element. The
Mm.
thing is, because it took me so long, I can't now identify which bits I made up, not all the time. So, I'm not sure which are legends for real and which are somehow, and if those now pass into local legend, well, nothing would delight me more, basically. So, I hope that happens.
You're very knowledgeable. I've been doing a lot of research on you, obviously, because in
Mhm.
preparation, and you're very, very knowledgeable about the history of the horror genre, and going back to the older films and older books and that sort
Yes,
of thing.
yes.
And yet, you've also said that if you made a list of your top 10 films, there wouldn't be a horror film in there.
That's true. Yes. Well, I mean, I have made that list, in fact, and
Yeah.
but yeah, no. I mean, if I made let's say 20, something a horror movie might well get in there, but 10, no. My all-time favorite horror movie, and it never really changes since I saw it, is the Night of the Demon, the
Mm.
with Dana Andrews, Peggy Cummins, and the wonderful, unsurpassable Neil McGuinness as Carswell, just one of the great performances, I think, in British cinema, actually, and certainly one of the all-time great villains, enormous amounts of nuance to his character and performance. And that would, but, maybe the top 20, yeah, I think Night of the Demon has to be there, but poor old Demon gets crowded out of the 10, that's the only thing.
Which other horror films have really sort of piqued your interest?
Oh gosh, well, I mean,
There's probably loads.
how far back do we go? Well, I suppose Nosferatu, the original Nosferatu,
Yeah.
it was still strikes me as being, possibly the most frightening adaptation of Dracula. I mean, just the sheer inhuman, cadaverousness of old Nosferatu himself, and there's still moments in that film which are extraordinarily unnerving, I think. King Kong, well, maybe we call that a monster film, but it still has a fair number of moments of genuine horror. And
Mm.
well, Robert Bloch, for one, would certainly always cite it as a horror film in the uncensored print, which is, the one we now see. Though
Yeah.
it tended to be trimmed about quite a lot in its earlier reissues, but not anymore. And that's certainly the greatest monster film ever made for my money. Mamoulian's Jekyll and Hyde with Frederick Marsh, I think, is by far the greatest version of that story, and again, still genuinely unnerving, and at times with a real sense of evil and menace to it. As poor old Miriam Hopkins becomes more and more kind of menaced by Hyde. Those scenes are I think as frightening as anything in any version of that story. What else can we say? Well, I'm going to have to do two Turner movies because I love Cat People from the start, the original Cat People. But
Yeah.
I Walked with a Zombie. Well, is that a horror film? Is that so delicate that it isn't a horror film? I don't know. Whatever it is, and I think it's a wholly mysterious movie. It's one of those films. While watching it, I know what I'm seeing. Soon as
Mm.
it's over, if you ask me what was that actually, and ask me to tell you the story, I can't do it. I've seen it innumerable times. It somehow slips away. It's like dreaming the film.
Mm.
So that I think is quite extraordinary. Now, what am I leaving out? Dear me. Well, Psycho obviously is extraordinary and well, what's the word I'm trying to think of? Well, rich beyond. Yes, inexhaustible is what I'm trying to get at here. Really, I think, and but also. again, is Vertigo a horror film? It's certainly a psychological horror tale,
Mm.
it seemed to me. If we class that as a horror movie, then I think that is Hitchcock's greatest horror film by far. And I do think it's Hitchcock's greatest film in any event, whatever we want to call it. So I'm going to slip that in. Peeping Tom is remarkable, and I saw that again very
Mm.
recently. Michael Powell still, is still a hugely confrontational movie.
Yeah.
Um, Lost Highway is probably my pick of the David Lynch's. I could, I could have half a dozen, but I think Lost Highway. Whenever I see it again, I mean that first, I don't know, half an hour or so. As soon as that goes on, we get, that opening shot of Bill Pullman in a state of abject terror. I basically think, oh God, now I'm going to do this to myself again, aren't I? And it really doesn't fade. The sense of utter dread we threw out that first section of something absolutely awful about to happen.
Mm.
It's still there, and of course we by now I more or less know what is going to happen, and several of the things are absolutely nightmarish. So it delivers in full. So I think that would probably be my choice. Although Mulholland Drive certainly is and so I think is Far Walk with Me a contender.
Yeah.
But no, okay. Well, let's say Lost Highway, and also, I've always held out for it. Although these days, sadly, I probably can't watch it anymore because I can't cope with extreme camera shake. But the Blair Witch Project, I actually think is in some ways the most Lovecraftian of all films, in terms of the fact that it works entirely on allusion and implication and things you don't quite see. I
Yeah.
mean, the worst thing you ever see is a bloody tooth. That's all you see, and yet it's utterly dreadful. But just the sense of something utterly wrong, and the documentary feel of it. It's very much like what Lovecraft counseled, and even
Yeah.
that title, The Blair Witch Project, it seems to be in the same vein as the facts in the case of Arthur Jermyn, or indeed of Monsieur Voldemar,
Mm.
that documentary approach to horror. So there's a few anyway. There's a few to be going on with.
Yeah. Would you say that the books like Lovecraft and to some extent, obviously Dracula, Frankenstein, would you say they're more sort of science fiction horror?
Well, yes, I mean, there's certainly, I mean, Brian Aldiss always argued for Frankenstein as the first modern science fiction novel. I think there's,
Mm.
something to be said for that. And yes, I do think it's science fiction, but it's also horror. And certainly Lovecraft. I mean, increasingly, once you get, well, I suppose we get to something like The Call of Cthulhu. Again, I'm the sort of approximate pronunciation, but yeah, yeah. So he moves on into things like The Whisperer in Darkness and The Mountains of Madness, and yeah, those are science fiction. And he gets increasingly science fictional, but there's always, I think, this drive toward communicating, cosmic dread. And
Mm.
sooner or later you're going to get that too. And I think there's no contradiction there to say that that's science fiction as well. So sure.
Mm. Do you think there's a weird modern trend to sort of humanize monsters? You always see it from you try to sort of see it from their side, and
Hmm.
and do you think that that's detrimental to the horror side of it?
Well, it can be. I think if you start, finding more and more humanity in your monster, I think to some extent Dracula, not Dracula in the Stoker novel, but Dracula in his many, many incarnations since, certainly there has been this increasing tendency to soften him, I think, and find reasons for him. And the other instance of this, I think, which is very striking, is Hannibal Lecter. I mean,
Mm.
who starts off as being, a completely dreadful, terrifying figure, and then it seems almost as if, Thomas Harris falls in love with his own character and needs to find excuses and justifications for him in a way. Now, he never completely loses sight of the fact that he is monstrous. Um, but there's a line in Red Dragon which is not about Lecter. It's about the Tooth Fairy, I think, isn't it? The
Yeah.
main menace in that novel. And there's something to the effect of I understand what his childhood was like, but now he's a monster and an adult, and you can't allow the child to be the excuse, which is what I believe myself actually. basically, about in more general terms. And I think he lost sight of that actually, Harris. But no, that's his choice. On the other hand, though, we go all the way back to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley, and she gives the monster a voice. We certainly have sympathy for him, or even depending whether we keep that sympathy once he becomes homicidal is a different matter. But we certainly understand him. We certainly have, I think, some empathy with him. So it's there from the very beginning, I think. But I think it's when it gets out of hand, as you suggest, sometimes it does these days, that it softens the horror too much.
Yeah. I forgot my next question. So.
Oh, okay, okay.
um, how do you think your own style's changed since the early days?
Oh, well, I don't quite know. It's a strange one because we just recently reissued The Nameless, which was written it was written more than 40 years ago.
Mm,
And alongside this, I think, looking at the copy edit of probably this most recent novel. So I was reading myself, as it were, 40 years apart. And in a way, there wasn't that much of a difference. The sentences are shorter in the old stuff. They've got more elaborate these days. And I tend to have particular sentence patterns. In a way, I feel like to break out of these again. I think I'm getting too basically too hemmed in by them stylistically, if you like. So I try to vary the stuff as much as I can. But it's perhaps time for a change again. Well, I did do that in. Yeah, so I try and do that every so often. If I see something I depend on as a writer, I try and do without it in a story and see what happens then.
yeah.
I've written the occasional story with absolutely no sort of atmosphere, just absolutely flat prose, maybe mainly dialogue, and see if that works. And it can work in surprising ways. And there was a book called a few novels back called Somebody's Voice. What a lot of that, for a while, each alternate chapter was written in the manner of a sort of a popular memoir, the sort of thing you find all over the place. These are, particularly of an abused childhood.
Mm,
So the prose wasn't meant to be that great. And I tried not to make it too much like my stuff, but just to make it more sort of, if you like, a sort of popular level of prose. So that seemed to work. And so I
mm.
can still do it, it seems. And I should probably do it more often.
Going back to The Nameless, it's probably my favorite of your
Oh,
novels.
thank
Uh,
you.
but there was a Spanish film made of the book as well, wasn't there? Did you
Yes.
get involved with that at all?
Did I have any input, you mean?
Yeah,
No. I mean, I tend not to want to do that, to be honest. I'd rather, sell the movie rights, whatever they may be, and let the people get on with it because they're better at it than I am, basically. I write prose, they make films, and it does depart. I mean, it departed in surprising ways. I mean, Jaume Balaguero is the writer-director. He said what he wanted to do was to capture the dread he felt in the novel. But it's interesting because he throws out all the supernatural elements pretty well. But he does keep the dread. There's no question about that. And he does keep that central theme of the corruption of innocence, which is well, interestingly, something that seems to appeal to Spanish filmmakers in my stuff because all three of the films that have been made over there, they all basically have that as a central issue. But as far as the dread is concerned, I mean the finale of Los Sin Nombre, or Jaume's film of The Nameless. They found an abandoned motel outside Barcelona, and they just moved in there, I believe, for about a week and shot all those scenes. And apparently they got themselves quite frightened by the setting, and I think that comes over in the movie, and that's exactly what we want, isn't it?
yeah. I've always liked you're very good at creating dread in the novels, and the paranoia as well.
Mm.
Um, there's two theories as well about monsters and in books. I know you don't really do monsters as such,
Yeah. Mm.
but what's your theory about this? I'll give you the two, right? So the first one is to describe a monster in a lot of detail before the action
Yes.
emerges, so that it doesn't get in the way of the action when it,
Yes.
um, or the other way around. Which way would
Yeah.
you?
Probably depending on the circumstances, both. I think I probably have done both. I mean, it's interesting. One of the very first examples of this is Lovecraft again. Yes, Call of Cthulhu. I'm now pronouncing it a different way, you see, just to guard against getting him right and invoking him. But I mean, in there, if you remember, you get a very detailed description of an image of a figurine of him.
Yeah.
So that when he does come on at the end, in reality, you don't have to describe that. We already know, in a sense, we have some sense of what he looks like, and now we can then now have this sense of monstrous immensity and complete inhumanity without going into detail again. Again, I mean, M.R. James has that in Canon Albrecht's scrapbook. There's an image of this demonic figure. In some details that when it manifests at the end, and I think Lovecraft probably took this idea from James, who he just read. In fact, he read the Ghost Stories of an Antiquary in 26, I think, and shortly after that he wrote his own story. So I think that was a bit of of an inspiration to him. But yeah, I think it depends on what the story needs, basically. I mean, in the main, I tend to describe, well, for me particularly one of the genius of M.R. James, is to describe just enough to suggest far worse, and that's basically I think what I try to do as well. So I hope it works.
When you said to me over Facebook, don't forget the Three Stooges.
Yes.
I was not aware of that at all, so I had to obviously research. And it's amazing. Right, so you've written a book called Six Stooges and Counting.
I have.
Right. I love the way that you like the work of like the early comedians like Laurel and Hardy and what we call the Three Stooges and all that
Yes.
sort of genre. And I like also how you've described how they've influenced modern directors like Tarantino and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Do you want to tell us about
Well, there's so much to tell, isn't there? But certainly, for instance, Tarantino actually made a spoof Three Stooges. It's only about 3 minutes long, which he shows, on television and interviews, that kind of thing. Basic thing is, what would happen if these, if all those things were real? Well,
that?
obviously it'd be extremely gory. But the interesting thing is, it's still played as a gag. It's a sort of, horrific gag of the sort of Sam Raimi kind, if you like. Because I mean, Evil Dead, okay, is again clearly influenced by the Stooges. And before they made Evil Dead, Sam Raimi and Robert Tappert and Bruce Campbell, they actually made their own Three Stooges imitation movies as, as teenagers or young men. And so that's where that influence comes from. Jack Kerouac, raved about them. Philip Roth said they were an influence on his writing. It is my contention, but you must decide how serious I am about this. I don't know if you know a movie called Room 237, which is about Kubrick's movie The Shining, and it has a bunch of various, well, should we say, extraordinary theories of what The Shining really is. So, for instance, there's one guy who argues with a lot of footage as evidence that what The Shining really is Kubrick's confession that he staged the moon landing. Well, there you go. You see, that's what it's really about. Well, my contention is no. The Shining is actually an extended, full-length tribute to the Three Stooges. And I'll show you all the evidence if you like. But I propose just one thing. The scene with Jack Torrance and Wendy going up that huge staircase. Famous scene. Give me the bat, Wendy. Give me the bat. And eventually he gets it. And that's what Moe would do, in the Three Stooges movie. Give me the wrench, dummy, give me the wrench. And obviously a big boing, it's the same thing. It's the Stooges. And I contend, well, I don't know, but that I'll go to my grave arguing that theory anyway. There you go.
Well, you're working on a new novel, aren't you? It's An Echo of Children.
Yes, I am.
Can you give us any information about that?
Well, I don't like to say too much about the novel in progress, but the basic sort of central thing is, as far as I'm concerned, I'm serious about this. Well, I'm serious about everything, but I'm serious about this for sure. Is that exorcism of children is a form of child abuse, and it can often be a lethal form of child abuse. There are hundreds of kids who've died of being exorcised or being treated as possessed
Hmm.
in this country alone. So, that's the background to the story. The setup is of in the past, such a dreadful incident has happened,
Yeah.
and the central couple, well, the young couple with their young son, become influenced by the lingering presence of this situation. It's actually seen from the viewpoint of the grandparents, however, and how much can they intervene? So it's got that sort of dilemma at its centre. So it's the old nuclear family which shows up as so much of my stuff, and if you like, the damaged family, and I hope it works. I mean, I'm just on the rewrite right now,
Yeah.
and I'm taking it apart and putting it together better again. I hope. So that will be, with any luck, that will be 2025.
Oh, excellent. I look forward to that. Genuinely. So,
Oh, hope you like it.
well, thank you very much for having this chat, Ramsey. It's been amazing. And it's
Sure, it's my pleasure, man. Thank you very much for having me.
really nice to meet you at last. Well, great. Well, thank you very much, mate. Thank you.
Well, have a good day. Have a
You
good day.
too. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye all. Bye everybody.